The tragedy of Xiangtangshan was not that it fell into ruin, it was that it was too easy to dismantle. Everything that made it extraordinary, its exquisite artistry, convenient transportation routes, and relatively soft limestone, became, in an age of turmoil, the very factors that accelerated its destruction. If you compare China's cave temples on a map, you'll find that not all of them suffered the same fate. Some were spared because they lay deep in remote mountains where transportation was prohibitively difficult. Others were simply too massive to cut apart. Still others remained under the long-term protection of local religious communities or powerful clans, making outside intervention nearly impossible. Xiangtangshan, however, occupied an unfortunate position. It possessed almost every characteristic that made it an ideal target. As we discussed in the previous episode, the first factor was its recognized artistic value. Carved during the Northern Qi dynasty in the 6th century, the Xiangtangshan Grottoes were an imperial-sponsored cave temple complex located near Ye, the dynasty's capital. By this period, Northern Qi sculpture had evolved beyond the rigid, monumental style of the earlier Northern Way. Its figures became more rounded, refined, and graceful. Buddhas with full, serene faces, richly adorned bodhisattvas, and elegant apsaras, celestial beings that seemed to float effortlessly through the air. By the early 20th century, these qualities had already been recognized by the international antiquities market as hallmarks of exceptional craftsmanship, giving Xiangtangshan a clear commercial appeal. The second factor was its physical structure. Xiangtangshan was not a single monolithic cliff that could only be preserved as a whole. Instead, it consisted of more than 30 cave temples containing countless independent or semi-independent sculptures, niches, Buddha heads, niche lintels, and relief carvings. Most of these were carved directly into relatively soft limestone, making them vulnerable to cutting with iron saws, chisels, and steel wedges. For antiquities dealers, the logic was simple. If it could be removed, it could be sold. Buddha heads were compact enough for transport and display, while architectural elements such as niche lintels could also be detached and marketed as individual works of art. The third factor was geography. Xiangtangshan is located on Mount Gu in today's Fengfeng mining district of Handan, Hebei province, along the eastern edge of the Taihang Mountains. Compared with cave temples hidden deep in the deserts or high plateaus of western China, it lay much closer to modern railways and established trade routes. Sculptures could be carried down from the cliffs to nearby railway stations and then transported to ports such as Tianjin for overseas shipment. This accessibility dramatically reduced the cost and difficulty of moving heavy stone artifacts. The southern Xiangtangshan Grottoes also stood near historic transportation corridors, including the Fuyang River, making the entire operation even more practical. The final, and perhaps most decisive factor, was the near absence of protection. During the final years of the Qing dynasty and the early Republican period, China was engulfed in political instability. Local governments were weak, and there was virtually no systematic protection for remote cave temples. Although Xiangtangshan had once been an imperial-sponsored religious monument, local residents generally regarded it simply as the Buddha statues on the mountain, not as a unified cultural heritage site that required preservation. Around the 1910s, as the Qing government collapsed and the country descended into warlord conflicts, authorities had neither the resources nor the capacity to intervene. When outside collectors and dealers arrived, they encountered little effective resistance. Large-scale looting and dismantling began around 1909. Taken together, these four conditions, high artistic value, a structure that could be dismantled, accessible transportation, and the absence of meaningful protection, transformed Xiangtangshan from a 6th century imperial cave temple into something that could be bought, divided, transported, and sold. It was not simply discovered by chance, nor was it an unfortunate random victim. Given the historical circumstances of the time, Xiangtangshan was almost destined to become a prime target of the international antiquities market. These four conditions put Xiangtangshan up for sale in an age of chaos. But greed alone was not enough to destroy an imperial monument that had stood for more than 1,000 years. To dismantle a site like this required something far more systematic, a cold, efficient chain of extraction that operated almost like an industry. In the story of Xiangtangshan's dispersal, the destroyers were never a single individual. They were part of a highly organized chain, with each link performing a specific role. What happened was not the work of one person, but of a system capable of operating continuously. A sculpture leaving the cave was not an abstract idea. It was a physical process, almost industrial in nature. Before a Buddha statue could appear in a museum gallery, it first had to pass through a carefully executed process of extraction, rather than a single act of destruction. At the very top of this chain stood the international antiquities trade and the global art market. This was where the targets were chosen. Not every sculpture was worth removing. The first to be selected were usually Buddha heads, Bodhisattva heads, and richly decorated high-relief carvings. These pieces were visually the most complete, the easiest to recognize as valuable works of art, and structurally the easiest to detach from the rock. In other words, they were the most important artistically, and the easiest to carry away physically. By the early 20th century, as Western museums and private collecting became increasingly institutionalized, stone sculptures from northern China had entered the global art market. A network of antiquities dealers active throughout East Asia began sourcing objects from northern China. Most never entered the mountains themselves. Instead, they relied on local intermediaries for information and supply. Japanese dealers, together with their European and American counterparts, formed the demand side of this market. They specified exactly what they wanted: Buddha heads, Bodhisattva heads, complete relief panels, even preferred sizes and stylistic quality. To them, Xiangtangshan was simply another source of high-quality, early Chinese sculpture. From the perspective of modern cultural heritage preservation, however, they were the primary force that set the destruction of the grottos in motion. Among the most influential figures in this network were Yamanaka Sadajiro and the Yamanaka & Co. trading empire, as well as C.T. Lu, whose Lai Yuan and Company and the affiliated Lu and Wu Company played major roles in exporting Chinese antiquities. Operating from Tokyo and Osaka, with branches in cities such as New York and London, these firms helped move sculptures from northern China directly into international auctions, museums, and private collections. But they were not the ones who physically cut the sculptures from the cliffs. That work belonged to the next layer of the system. The second layer consisted of local Chinese dealers and middlemen. This network included antiquities brokers familiar with the region, merchants who controlled transportation, and local contacts connected to villages surrounding the cave temples. Their job was to turn market demand into a practical operation. Once they learned that a particular sculpture had attracted a buyer, they assembled crews and organized expeditions to dismantle it on site. The third layer consisted of the people who carried out the extraction itself, stonemasons and laborers. These workers were rarely involved in the trade itself. Their responsibility was purely practical: how to separate a stone sculpture from the living rock. In the field, the work relied on simple but devastating hand tools: iron saws, steel wedges, chisels, and wooden wedges. They typically began at the sculpture's weakest structural points, such as the neck, the shoulders, or the edges of a niche. Steel wedges were driven into the limestone to create fractures. Wooden wedges were then inserted and repeatedly hammered, gradually widening the cracks. Once the stone had loosened, saws and pry bars were used to detach the sculpture from the cliff. The goal was not simply to destroy the sculpture, it was to separate it in a controlled manner. They were not trying to smash the image. Their objective was to preserve as much of its visible front as possible while sacrificing the stone that connected it to the cliff. Larger sculptures often required temporary wooden scaffolding, ropes, and teams of workers to support the weight as sections were carefully pried loose or cut away in stages. There is a painful irony in this process. The descendants of craftsmen who had once spent years carving these sacred images in service of an imperial Buddhist project were now, for the price of a few silver coins, drawing iron saws across the necks of those same Buddhas. As steel scraped against limestone, it produced a shrill, grating sound, filling the air with white stone dust. Every inch the saw advanced was another brutal cut through the artistic vision of the northern Qi dynasty. The evidence of that process is still visible at Xiangtangshan today. Many statues are severed by remarkably flat, clean cuts where the head once joined the body. What may appear to be natural damage is, in many cases, the unmistakable result of deliberate human intervention. Those smooth fracture surfaces were intentionally created so that Buddha heads could be detached, transported, and sold as individual works of art. Once the sculptures had been cut free, the next step was stabilization and packing. After leaving the cliff, the stone fragments had to be secured for transport. Workers used wooden frames, hemp ropes, and sometimes even metal supports to fasten Buddha heads and other detached pieces into makeshift crates, minimizing damage during the long journey ahead. Larger architectural fragments required teams of laborers to move them with pulleys, sledges, or temporary ramps, gradually lowering them from the mountainside to the valley below. The fourth layer of the chain was transportation. The detached sculptures were carried out of the mountains by human labor and pack animals. From there, they were loaded onto carts, taken to railway stations, and transported to major ports before being shipped overseas. By the early 20th century, this logistical network was already well established, but allowing cultural artifacts from northern China to move with remarkable efficiency into the international antiquities market. During this journey, the sculptures underwent a profound transformation. What had once been an integral part of a sacred religious space was reduced to something else entirely, a piece of cargo. The fifth and final layer was the receiving end of the chain, museums and private collections. After arriving in Europe or North America, the fragments from Xiangtangshan were cataloged, appraised, and reintroduced under new identities such as Northern Qi Buddhist sculpture or early Chinese stone sculpture. Within these new contexts, they acquired new meanings and new scholarly value, but the relationships that had once connected them inside the cave temples had been permanently severed. Today, sculptures from the northern dynasties, including works from Xiangtangshan, can be found in institutions such as the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Harvard Art Museums, the Freer Gallery of Art of the Smithsonian Institution, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, among many others. Yet every link in this chain shared one remarkable characteristic. No single participant ever understood the sculptures as parts of an integrated cave temple. To the antiquities dealer, they were merchandise. To the middlemen, they were profit. To the stonemason, they were blocks of stone that could be cut. To the museum, they were works of art. Only Xiangtangshan itself held all of these pieces together as a single coherent whole. And once that whole was dismantled, the central question was no longer who made the final cut. The real issue was that every layer of the system, each performing its own role, made the dismantling possible. So, when we ask who dismantled Xiangtangshan, the answer is neither one individual nor one nation. It was an entire chain stretching across local communities, international markets, and national borders. And Xiangtangshan disappeared not in a single moment, but gradually, link by link, as every part of that chain did its work. The next stage was transportation. The journey typically unfolded in three phases, from the mountain to a town and finally to a port. The first stage relied on human labor and pack animals. Mules, ox carts, and wooden wagons slowly carried the heavy stone sculptures down narrow mountain roads and out of the valleys. The second stage connected them to the regional transportation network. As modern railways and roads expanded across northern China, the sculptures were transferred to urban distribution centers. The third stage was international shipment. From major ports, they were loaded onto ships bound for Japan, Europe, or the United States, where they entered auction houses, museums, and private collections. During this journey, something fundamental happened. What had once been an inseparable part of a sacred religious space was transformed into a movable commodity. More importantly, this was not a single act of destruction. It was an ongoing process. Different caves, different sections of the site, and different types of sculptures were removed over many years in multiple waves. The Xiangtangshan we see today was not destroyed in a single catastrophic moment. It was the result of a slow, systematic dismantling that unfolded over decades. The consequences were structural. In caves that were once complete, Buddha statues lost their heads. Attendant bodhisattvas were left without bodies or crowns. Entire niche lintels were cut away. Reliefs of apsaras and celestial musicians survived only in fragments. But the most significant loss was not any individual sculpture. It was the disappearance of their relationships. Inside the original cave temples, every element depended on the others. The central Buddha established the spiritual and visual focus of the space. The bodhisattvas created balance on either side. The apsaras animated the ceiling with movement. Decorative carvings unified the entire composition through rhythm and repetition. Once removed, however, these elements became isolated objects. A Buddha head could now be displayed on its own in a museum. A bodhisattva head could be exhibited in a separate gallery. A niche lintel could hang independently on a wall. Each object still existed. Some were even remarkably well preserved. But the relationships that once gave them meaning had disappeared. This is the heart of the story. The destruction of Xiangtangshan was not simply physical damage. It was a structural rupture. The site was not smashed into ruins. It was carefully dismantled into pieces that could function and be valued independently. So when we encounter sculptures from Xiangtangshan in museums around the world today, what we are really seeing are the surviving fragments of a system whose internal connections have been broken. The sculptures are still beautiful. Many are still intact, but they no longer belong to the same world. One of the most striking features of the dispersal of the Xiangtangshan Grottoes is that its sculptures did not end up in a single country or a single institution. Instead, they were scattered across multiple collecting traditions, each with its own way of interpreting and displaying them. The first major destination was the network of American universities and public museums. From the early to the mid-20th century, large numbers of Buddhist stone sculptures from northern China entered collections along the east coast of the United States. Among the earliest institutions to systematically collect Chinese Buddhist sculpture was the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Within its research and exhibition programs, these works were reclassified and presented as part of the broader history of Asian art. At the same time, the Harvard Art Museums acquired a number of fragments from the northern dynasties, including Buddha heads and Bodhisattva heads. These objects typically entered the collection under categories such as Northern Qi sculpture or early Chinese Buddhist art, where they became important material for the study and teaching of art history. On a broader level, institutions such as the Freer Gallery of Art of the Smithsonian Institution helped establish a comprehensive framework for the study of Asian art. Within this context, sculptures from northern Chinese cave temples, including those from Xiangtangshan, came to be valued as key works for the comparative study of Buddhist and Asian religious art. Inside these museums, however, the sculptures underwent a fundamental transformation. They were no longer presented as parts of a cave temple. They were redefined as independent works of sculpture. Displayed individually on pedestals or gallery walls, the emphasis shifted to their form, style, craftsmanship, and aesthetic qualities, rather than the spatial relationships that had once connected them within the original cave. The second major destination was Europe's network of private collections and public museums. During the first half of the 20th century, the European art market also developed a strong appetite for Chinese Buddhist sculpture. Stone carvings from northern China entered private collections in countries such as Britain, France, and Germany, with many later finding their way into public museums. Once in Europe, these works were typically classified as ancient Oriental art or Asian religious art. They were often displayed alongside Gandharan sculpture from India and Buddhist sculpture from Japan, becoming part of a broader cross-cultural narrative of Asian religious art. The third destination was Japan's antiquities market and collecting community. For both geographic and historical reasons, Japan developed a sophisticated market for East Asian antiquities earlier than many other countries. Dealers such as Yamanaka Sadajiro and his firm, Yamanaka & Co., played a central role in acquiring and reselling Chinese Buddhist sculpture through offices in Tokyo, Osaka, and overseas branches. Within this network, large numbers of Buddha heads, Bodhisattva heads, and relief carvings from northern China were first transported to Japan before being redistributed to Europe, North America, or private collectors around the world. The fourth destination was the global auction market and private collections. As the international art market expanded during the second half of the 20th century, fragments from Xiangtangshan began appearing regularly at major auction houses. Their provenance was often recorded simply as Northern Qi stone sculpture or Buddhist sculpture from northern China, while their original connection to a specific cave temple became increasingly difficult to trace. As a result, different parts of the same cave could be sold to different buyers and ultimately follow entirely separate collecting histories. The outcome was profoundly symbolic. Pieces that had once belonged to a single cave became scattered across different continents. A Buddha head might be displayed in a museum on the east coast of the United States. The body of its accompanying bodhisattva might reside in a university collection hundreds or even thousands of miles away. A carved niche lintel might disappear into a private collection. Meanwhile, the cave itself still remains in the mountains of Hebei. This is what makes Xiangtangshan such an extraordinary example of a fragmented cave temple. Viewed inside any one museum, each sculpture appears complete. But viewed on a global scale, these complete masterpieces reveal themselves to be only isolated fragments, cut away from a much larger whole. The dispersal of Xiangtangshan, therefore, was not simply the loss of cultural objects. It was the global fragmentation of an integrated work of art. What was once a single sacred space carved into a mountainside became a collection dispersed across museums, auction houses, and private collections around the world. And that fragmentation leads directly to an even more important question. If all of the pieces still exist, why can we no longer truly see Xiangtangshan? If you traveled the world and gathered every scattered fragment piece by piece, would you recover the Xiangtangshan that once existed? Unfortunately, the answer is no. Because what Xiangtangshan lost was never just its individual sculptures. It lost the soul of the system that held them together. On the surface, the damage seems easy to describe. Buddha heads were cut away. Bodhisattvas were left incomplete. Relief carvings were dispersed across museums and private collections around the world. But if we shift our perspective from individual objects to the site as a whole, a more fundamental loss comes into view. What Xiangtangshan truly lost was not a collection of parts. It was the integrity of an integrated system. Cave temple art is not simply a collection of sculptures. It is a way of organizing space. Its meaning does not reside in any single figure, but in the relationships between all of them. Inside a complete Xiangtangshan cave, the Buddha was never an isolated masterpiece standing alone. It served as the anchor of the entire spatial composition. The principal Buddha established the visual center. The bodhisattvas created balance on either side. The apsaras animated the ceiling with movement. Decorative patterns unified the boundaries of the space through rhythm and repetition. Together, these elements transformed the cave into a coherent spatial system, one that could be experienced and, in a sense, read. Once these elements were separated, however, the result was not merely the loss of individual pieces. It was the collapse of the structure itself. The most immediate loss was the disappearance of spatial relationships. When a Buddha head is displayed today in the Harvard Art Museums or the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the environment that once gave it meaning no longer exists. Its proportions in relation to the surrounding bodhisattvas, its vertical dialogue with the apsaras on the ceiling, and its visual rhythm with the carved niche lintel have all been severed. Inside the museum, it becomes an independent object. Inside the cave, it was only one node within a much larger composition. That transformation changes more than the way we look at it. It changes what the sculpture means. Another loss is the disappearance of temporal experience. A cave temple was never meant to be understood at a single glance. It was designed as a journey. Visitors approached from outside the mountain, entered the darkness of the cave, gradually moved toward the central shrine, and finally lifted their eyes to the carvings above. The architecture itself choreographed the experience through movement and time. A museum compresses that entire sequence into an instant. Visitors may walk around the sculpture or examine it from every angle, but they no longer experience the gradual unfolding that the cave was designed to create. In other words, Xiangtangshan's original rhythm of viewing has been lost entirely. The third loss is the disappearance of its visual grammar. If we think of Xiangtangshan as a visual language, then its grammar consisted of three essential elements: the center, the Buddha; the structure, the bodhisattvas and their spatial relationships; the rhetoric, the apsaras and the decorative program. Within the complete cave, these three elements were inseparable. They constrained one another, reinforced one another, and together generated meaning. Once the site was fragmented, however, each element entered an entirely different context. The Buddhas became subjects of art history. The bodhisattvas became objects of stylistic analysis. The decorative carvings became examples of craftsmanship and ornament. Each individual component came to be understood more clearly. But the sentence they once formed disappeared. This is the heart of the problem. The loss of Xiangtangshan was not a reduction in content. It was the disappearance of an entire structure of meaning. The fourth loss is an irreversible break in space itself. Cave temple art possesses one defining characteristic. It is an integrated work of art that cannot be moved. The moment any part is removed from its original setting, it ceases to be the original work. It becomes a fragment of something larger. This also explains why, even if we could digitally reunite every Buddha head, every bodhisattva, and every apsara today, the result would still be only a reconstruction. It could recreate the appearance of Xiangtangshan. It could never restore the experience of Xiangtangshan as a sacred space, because the real Xiangtangshan was never just a collection of forms. It was the network of relationships that existed within that space. This leads us to perhaps the most important conclusion of all. What Xiangtangshan lost was not its objects. It lost its structure. It lost not its sculptures, but the system that connected them. It lost not simply a work of art, but the spatial relationships that gave that work its meaning. Seen from this perspective, the destruction of Xiangtangshan was never a single historical event. It was a prolonged process of disintegration. By the time the last fragment was removed from the mountainside, Xiangtangshan no longer existed as an integrated work of art. What remained were visual fragments scattered across museums and collections around the world. They are still important. They are still extraordinary, but they no longer point to the same world. And that is what Xiangtangshan truly lost.